Good morning, all. I trust you're keeping safe and well. It's my great pleasure today to host today's webinar on the subject of how to future-proof your business. The last year has undoubtedly tested the resilience and flexibility of all organisations as they've had to adapt to the changes brought as a result of COVID. And whilst we now appear to be on the way out of this pandemic, touch wood, many challenges and obstacles still remain. And this is without factoring in any other unforeseen challenges that may present themselves either at a macro or micro level. My name is Guy Armitage-Norton, and I'm a partner within our accounts and audit department at Milstead Langdon, based in our Bristol office. We also have offices in Taunton, Bath, Yeovil and London. And whilst we cover the traditional service lines you'd expect from accountancy practice, given our size of clients and our client base, we've expanded over the years to include specialist teams that are usually the preserve of the big four or national firms, such as our corporate finance team and VAT department. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Simon Rowe, who many of you, I'm sure you will know, who will be speaking later in the webinar. Simon trained as a licensed insolvency practitioner, which gave him a valuable experience in dealing with all aspects of not just insolvency, but also business recovery. He was therefore well positioned to become the firm's head of business intervention, being able to step in when the unforeseen becomes a reality and has a significant impact on the business and/or its owners. Simon will be today discussing key considerations of a chief restructuring officer and what they need to think about in advance of a financial crisis and what might happen as a result of that and how crucial changes can be implemented to kind of deal with the financial crises that may arise. Joining Simon is Nick Moon. He's the Managing Director of Applied Resilience. With over a decade of experience in the sector, Nick has been party to a number of high-profile resilience planning and incident responses, including the London 2012 Olympics and EU emergency planning exercises. He managed to take those skills across to Applied Resilience, where they provide a range of expertise. This is from the practical. I think you were the first ones to set up the first COVID test site in Epsom, as well as the conceptual, working with boardrooms to assist senior management in getting their organisations resilient. I'm sure, having spoken with Nick on a few occasions now, I've probably done him a great disservice with the excellent work they do. So I'll let you properly introduce Applied Resilience more aptly in a moment. But first, a brief summary of the topics that we plan to cover in today's seminar. First of all, we're going to cover how to consider strategic risks. Secondly, initial learning from COVID-19. Thirdly, we're going to look at case studies of good and bad crisis communication and what this looks like. And finally, what strong, resilient organisations have in common and how to avoid the most common pitfalls. I will be checking the Q&A throughout, so please feel free to ask questions as and when they arise. But we do have time at the end of this webinar to field any questions if you do want to hold off and ask yourself at the end. Without further ado, I'll pass you over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Guy, and good morning, everybody. Guy, if you could just allow me to share the screen.
My trusty assistant to help me.
So as Guy was saying, Applied Resilience, we work with all sectors in the civil emergency response side, and also which we do with local authorities and the NHS, and then also with industry and academia for sort of more internally based threats. So it's definitely more the internally based or the internally impacting risks that I'll be speaking to you about this morning. Okay, so
should be now working, Nick.
Yep, just took me a second. Right. Okay. So first of all, sorry, just while I'm trying to get this sorted out. First of all, what do we mean by business resilience? There are a couple of key definitions. So one of them is sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble sharing my screen. Having a business resilient issue at the moment. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, guys. Okay. Okay. So How do we define it? Well, there are a couple of key definitions. First one is the international standard, so ISO, which is for crisis management, and it's quite long and lengthy. I don't plan to go through it, but it's a key definition that is worth looking up if you're trying to define it. And another good one is the Business Continuity Institute. But effectively, what we're talking about is being able to absorb the impacts of an incident and mitigate the effects on the business. It's not about making sure that everything carries on as if nothing is wrong. It is about making sure that your core functions aren't affected or minimizing the impact on them, so that business critical activities can carry on regardless of the impact of what's happening. So don't try and think of it in terms of just keeping everything as if there's no problem here. It is about sort of being able to adapt and ensure that through your response you can maintain your core functions. In terms of where to start, it can be quite a minefield, and it can sort of, sometimes people struggle to think, where do I start for this? What we'd recommend is thinking about it from a risk impact point of view. So, there are all sorts of scenarios depending on what site you work, whether you've got multiple offices, whether you're based from home, whatever it might be, or you've got depots on multiple sites. There are all sorts of things that could happen to prevent access to those. You could be find yourself within a cordon. So the picture there is the Holborn Underground fire, happened a few years ago in London. So large cordon went up, big chunk of central London was evacuated for a good 24, 48 hours. But it could be numerous things. It could be a bomb threat. It could be a fire. It could be anything. The point is that the impact is that you no longer have access to your site. You've been denied access to your site. And there are things like, what time does that happen? So is that sort of the middle of the night? In which case, would you know about it, or how resilient is that? And can you get out messages to staff before they all descend in the morning? Or is it in the middle of the day, a busy day, when you are there's a disorderly evacuation and you're standing outside in the rain, wondering what's going on? Lots of people not having their bags and their keys and their wallets, so or potentially don't have access to their cars because that's within the cordon, for example. So and is it long term? Is it short term? Are you going to be able to get back in, or is that no? That's the flames are licking up the building. We're definitely not getting back in anytime soon. So again, triggered by all sorts of things. Could be a flood, but you have been denied access to your site. So consider the impacts of denial of access. The other one is increasingly coming up the agenda. So ICT or cyber impacts. Could be that a national or regional. It could be international. So solar winds is obviously being sort of better understood in terms of the impact that's had and having. Or you could be specifically targeted. It could be a phishing email, or it could be, I've seen floods in server rooms, power cuts, and your generators don't kick in, whatever it might be. You don't have access to your ICT anymore. Do you understand, in a potential crisis situation, what the impact of that is? And do staff understand what the fallback looks like? Severe weather, adverse weather, again, that's another one that we just know is going to happen. We're getting more events happening, and they're more severe. So, do you have responsibilities to protect your staff, or to take additional service measures? But also, have you considered impact of staff getting in and out, and how you sort of manage that impact? Again, we know that it's going to come along, so it's another one that's worth considering. Supply chain disruption. Obviously, there was a live example recently with Suez Canal, but supply chains have been stretched to breaking point and have indeed broken in many instances during COVID. And interestingly, the analysis is showing that actually it's not just sort of tier 1 suppliers, it's also tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So how well do you organizationally understand your reliance on your suppliers, and then their suppliers and their suppliers? And again, it might not be that you do this for everything, but it would be worth probably doing it for your critical, business critical functions. Do you have mitigations in place? Do you understand how quickly it will impact on you? Do you have some draft messages and so on? So supply disruption is definitely a big one too. And all of those sort of risks, so adverse weather, cyber attacks, terrorism, and so on, they're all very high on the National Risk Register. So if you're not sure where to start and you want to sort of have a sobering read, then the National Risk Register is published, and there's all sorts of quite relevant information on there that is worth considering within the business context. Because we've seen with COVID and things like the volcanic ash cloud and foot and mouth, that civil incidents will have, and flooding, civil incidents do knock on and have a big impact, obviously, on business. So that being said, where do you start? So after you've done your considered your potential risks, where do you start? It's worth considering the Business Continuity Institute cycle for business continuity management here. It's a bit of a slog to go round the wheel, but once you've gone round, it's sort of a maintenance cycle is much more manageable. And probably the key, or one of the key functions is, or aspects of that, is the analysis phase. If you don't have a clear-eyed view of your service functions and their dependencies, then you're going to struggle straight off the bat. So the analysis stage is really, really important. I just wanted to take a second to talk about that, sort of give more information. So obviously everyone knows what they do, what their business does, but have you really sort of drilled down in terms of business impact analysis function on your services? If we take an example like customer services, so everyone has a good idea of what customer services do, but through a business impact analysis, you might find that when you split it down, you might say, actually, customer services, they answer calls, but they also transfer calls, they take payments and bookings, and they also manage front of house and the visitor book. So actually they are quite distinct functions, and you might not care about all of them as much at the same time. So break the service down into sort of your key deliverable areas if you can, because it will give you a better understanding of which functions might be more important to you, and therefore workaround options. Once you've done that, you want to do an impact assessment on it. So what happens if that function stops? It doesn't matter why. There's plenty of, when we meet with people to help go through these in the workshops and sort of one-on-one sessions, we often hear, well, that won't happen because, it's all hosted on the cloud, or, we've got a backup or whatever. It doesn't matter. There are so many examples of where, for whatever reason, your best laid plans won't work, and you haven't got it. So what are the consequences of that? And work back from that. So consider things like impact criteria. So is it a life and limb function? Is it contractual or statutory or underpinning one? Does it have a significant level of financial impact? And what's the reputational impact or potential reputational impact? And this is something that you want to consider organizationally, if you can, even if it's just the results of the BIAs are sort of looked at by management team, but you might feel differently about the level of impact. So for example, a simple one like phones ringing and phones being answered. We ask some chief execs, we'll be doing a tabletop exercise with them and say, well, the phones have been ringing for 5 minutes now. Can we divert them remotely? We can't get back in. And what level of how long are you comfortable with the phones not being answered? Some will say, I've heard some say, oh, I think we can cope with a day, without the calls being answered. They can still use the website, which is fine. And then others will say, we can't not answer the phone. We really can't have a downtime. That would be, that's just no good from a business impact point of view. So, it is worth checking, and different levels of the organization might feel differently. So we've worked with sort of a busy airport, and you can often get a differential in what sort of operational people think. You might get someone from management team turn up and say, oh my God, what is happening here? It's like, well, this is a Tuesday afternoon, welcome to it. Whereas it could be the other way around, whereas your service operators could be saying, we are really potentially in a crisis here. And then sort of at the strategic level, they might be saying, we think it's fine. So as long as you really need to be on the same page, otherwise you're going to be in trouble straight away, especially with a fast moving incident. So that's your impact assessment. And then once you've done that, you can then divvy up your functions by priority. So this is just sort of an example. It could be that actually, reception visitor book is critical because that's linked to the fire evacuation, and we have to make sure we've got visitors accounted for and so on. Answering calls is essential because it's really embarrassing, to have the phone ringing off the hook. Directing calls is important, but not as important. And then taking payments, we don't worry about for the first day or the first 2 days. We can catch up with those. whatever it might be. Consider what your minimal acceptable levels and timeframes are. So how long can you tolerate this function not happening? And also consider, what are your recovery time objectives? So when are we aiming to get it back? So if you've got an IT department or an IT provider and you lose IT for whatever reason, when are they anticipating it to be recovered? Because if IT is saying 48 hours and your finance department have got a toleration period of 24 hours for some of their core functions, then you're immediately in trouble unless you can mitigate them. So you need to have sort of clear-eyed view of what your recovery time objectives are as well. So that IT know that they need to spin up, say, the virtual call center first, and because that's a priority. So it's just working through those things, it's just sort of joining them up, and it doesn't have to be everything, just your core functions to make it slightly more manageable. Then think about what resources you need. So what people, what skills, what telephony, email access they need, what system access, space and equipment, HR support. And again, don't forget to consider that in the context of no cyber, no internet or ICT, because it is possible. It depends how your internet is set up. But if you've got service on site, for example, then loss of denial of access and then loss of IT is quite common. So yeah, you want to consider that as well. And it might be that you scale the resources down. So you might say, actually, normally we have a team of 15 people, but we can cope with 5 people working from home for 48 hours if we absolutely have to. And we're going to try and do as much over the website as possible, and so on. So the solution will be based on what you think is appropriate. But what we're aiming for is a staged approach. So we know that sort of immediately we're going to be spinning up answering calls, reception and visitors. Then day 2, we're going to be looking at transfer calls and bookings and bringing that back online. And then by day 3, we're hoping to have payments and recovery process up and running. So it allows for a more staged and manageable response, because trust me, during the middle of an incident, you won't have capacity to consider a lot of these things. So once you've got a good understanding of what you're sort of working to protect, as it were, you can now start planning. And it's not so much in the plan, it is in the planning process itself. So you might find, actually, for one of your services, you're just not comfortable with that level of risk. You might want to mitigate it straight away. So an example that I like to use was one large organization only had one person that could use the payroll system, and they were part-time. So you just think that's just such a high risk. You would just mitigate that immediately. You wouldn't rely on contingency planning for that. You would make sure other people are trained up, that they can access the system, and just get rid of that problem. Build it into your business continuity plan. Obviously, it's a key function, but don't rely on continuity planning. Just mitigate it. And that could be such as replication. So we do the same thing elsewhere. Could be diversification. So for example, with phones, you could have mobiles, you could have WhatsApp, you could have Signal, you could have VoIP. You could have standby arrangements. So you could say, when this happens, then you guys come along and do something. You could just contract out the whole lot and make it someone else's problem, which is fine, but you need to make sure that you've put the requirements for business continuity, business resilience onto them, and then check that they actually do them, because a lot of the time the plans are sort of, the front cover says business continuity, but what's underneath it is sort of a health and safety plan or something else entirely. So consider that. Or everyone's favorite, you could just do nothing, which is perfectly acceptable for some risks. If you're in the middle of a move with your IT or a new corporate management system, or you might decide to just consider the risk acceptable for 3 months, 6 months. Again, make that a corporate decision. Make sure everyone's on the same page, or rely on contingency planning if you have to. In terms of the plan, use your business impact analysis results to inform your plan. So as you've listed your core functions and their priority, base your responses on that. I would suggest, don't think of it in terms of one plan. For a start, strip out all the policy. You don't need it in your plan. You need it in a policy. It's not helpful during an incident. But it could be things like aid memoirs. It could be panic sheets. It could be Z cards, online platforms, and it could be a plan on a shelf. That's fine, whatever is required, but keep it simple, keep it useful. Consider your trigger points. So what point does something start, or what point do you consider something? It was really interesting during COVID, the organizations that were ahead of the curve, and then the organizations that didn't think it was going to be an issue and then they realized it was too late. And the ones that were sort of horizon scanning and thinking about it were well ahead. Lloyd's of London, for example, were very early very early on, before it was declared a pandemic, closed their trading floor, moved it virtual, their entire trading floor virtual for a day. So it was a huge operation, hugely disruptive, really irritating to everybody. But they learned so much that when they actually had to do it, really, it was much, much smoother. Your planning will trigger changes, as I said. So you might find that actually you start lifting up rocks and you go, no, let's just change this straight away. And don't forget the basics. So things like keeping in touch with staff. How do you do that? How do you do that without your VoIP system, for example? Key documents, really, we see all sorts of things like, yes, I have the key for the IT disk backups. Great, where is it? It's in the building next to on my desk that's just burnt down. So simple things like that you want to consider. The other thing that I'd say is essential, it's critical, is to practice. You must just have a run through, even if it's just a discussion in a team meeting or in a management team. Ideally, it would be sort of a more structured tabletop exercise or a call out exercise. You bolt it onto your fire drill. So if you've got to do a fire drill, you've got to evacuate everyone. Just instead of letting them back in, say, no, please activate your business continuity plans. Leave them to sort of panic for 5 minutes, and then it's a good time to start talking to them about business continuity, because it really does focus the mind. Obviously, they're busy people; they've got lots of other things to do. So, but it helps people. It helps embed, and it helps people realize actually this will be our problem, not a corporate problem. It's a bit like health and safety. It kind of it really, everybody needs to sort of be involved to a certain degree. Communication, you can't over communicate, you can't over plan to communicate. Everyone probably knows that, but it's one thing sort of repeating it, but it's another actually doing it. You need to seriously consider it and your strategies. So staff, how do you communicate to your different staff groups? What about those that don't have IT? What about those that can't necessarily easily work from home? Think about your different staff-based, maybe operational teams might respond differently from corporate teams. I don't know. Clients, so what are you saying to your clients? Obviously, your suppliers, key stakeholders like your board or other sort of strategic partners. And then also, don't forget your incident management process. How does information flow around the organization in a crisis? How do you know that something's happening at the depot? How does that get communicated to an incident management team? Do you have an incident management team? Do they know their roles and responsibilities? So that's something that you definitely want to consider. And again, you might not have IT, so you might want to just make sure that you understand that communication flow without IT. And obviously, we're becoming increasingly dependent on IT, us included. In terms of communication, again, ideally, you'll have had a couple of key people that sort of are nominated as the spokespeople for the organization potentially, and ideally they've had a little bit of training or a little bit of practice, or at least have thought about it. Trust me, it's quite daunting when you've been dealing with an incident for sort of 17 hours and then you have to go and speak to Sky News. It's a challenge. So consider things like a simple message grid. So this part of, we do crisis management comms training, and this is a really helpful tool. So this is an example for a waste collection company. Something's happened. It could be adverse weather, could be a depot, could be something like we've seen recently where someone broke into the depot, stole the diesel, ripped out a load of piping, the diesel spilled into the local river, caused a pollution incident, and it sort of became a multi-agency incident as well as a business continuity challenge. Could be that we've also seen someone's broken in and stolen all the batteries from all the vehicles. You get in there at 5 a.m. to start and you can't. Whatever it might be, something like a message grid will be really helpful to communicate to all your stakeholders. So what you want to think about is what your key messages are. So what are the key messages organizationally we want to push out? Well, we want to say that waste and recycling will be collected. So, don't panic. If we haven't got it, we will come and get it. We'll collect your side waste, so just calm down. We will come to you eventually. That's the key message you want to get out. And you also want to drive people to the website, for example, for the latest information or text alerts that you're planning to send them. Then you want to support those key messages with facts and figures because it helps strengthen your point. So it could be something like every day we're collecting 700,000 tons of waste every day, and we're delivering 100 extra hours of staff, whatever it might be. Then you also ideally would like a story. People, humans respond well to stories, and they're sort of more sympathetic. So, during a severe snow, I remember a story of a Sussex fire officer who walked through the night, through the snow, because he had to abandon his car to get to help and to get to his shift on time. So, that gave them really good free media sort of saying, we are trying. It could be a picture of what you're dealing with. I don't know, whatever it might be. And your comms team will obviously, if you have one, can obviously help with things like that. But stories are great. And then when you get a question, when you get asked to sort of ask something, you can use your message grid to hit that. You want to hit as many of these points as possible. So it's sort of answer and response as opposed to necessarily answer and question. It depends how much your back's against the wall. But this can be useful for you as a spokesman, but it can also be useful for things like customer services, staff out on the ground. So you want to try and hit as many of these as you can. And then that you're all working off the same message. You're all organizationally getting the key messages across. Really simple, really easy. You can write these ahead of time, or you write them pretty early on during the crisis and then keep them updated. So that's just a simple tool that you might want to consider. Never waste a good crisis as well. So there's opportunities to actually get benefits from a crisis if you're really lucky. And I've just got a short case study here from KFC, which some of you might remember. Some of you might even be, tragically affected by not being able to shop at KFC for a little while. Let me just see if it plays.
It is a humiliating sight for one of the country's biggest food brands. Hundreds of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants across the UK were forced to shut down over the weekend.
The fast food giant blaming teething problems with a new delivery contract.
I'm mad at KFC. I've had to go to Burger King.
We're sorry. A chicken restaurant without chicken. It's not ideal. Huge apologies to our customers, especially those who travelled out of their way to find we were closed. An endless thanks to our KFC team members and franchise partners for working tirelessly to improve the situation. It's been a hell of a week, but we're making progress, and every day more and more fresh chicken is being delivered to our restaurants. Thank you for bearing with us.
KFC today printed an apology in a couple of newspapers. Have a look at what they did to their logo.
The chain issued this apology. Has apologized.
The teacher got a full-page apology.
Rearranged its letters, KFC.
So obviously that's a pretty good case study of how corporate comms can support during a crisis. And they used an agency that were really embedded with them, and they made a clear decision early on that they were going to look after their staff, and they were going to support their teams, and they were going to sort of face it head on. A lot of organizations, not a lot, some organizations we speak to will say, well, what if this happens? So in this case, your distribution center is completely blocked at both ends, basically. And a lot of people, particularly sort of at the more junior level, will say, oh, well, then we're stuffed. We wouldn't be able to do anything. It's like, well, okay, is that your sort of final position, or would you actually do something? In which case, if you would actually do something, then you need to start planning for it, even if it's just apologizing. Get that bit right at least. So you do want to sort of consider that. I don't need to watch it again. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It could be quite simple. So this is a harrowing personal story where my pizza oven has got stuck on the Suez Canal. And they just sent a simple email saying, really early on, saying, yes, I'm sorry, your pizza oven is on that boat. This are the options that we think might happen. We're going to keep you posted. If you want to cancel any time, you can, but we'd love it if you hang on. That was just an email. Really, really simple. Make sure that you embed what works. So where you've got something that's good, particularly during COVID, lock it in, because when that staff move on, you can have a great plan for 2 years and then in 3 years, it's just completely fallen by the wayside and no one knows about it. So make sure you embed what works. In terms of learning from COVID, a lot of it, I mean, I based this sort of talk around a lot of the learning, but, plan for the unexpected for sure, but also plan for the expected. So a lot of stuff is obvious. A lot of information is out there. You should plan for it, but also don't fall into the trap of planning for the last incident. So, everyone sort of thinks they can deal with social distancing now, so on. But have you considered, for example, cyber? Have you considered, for example, a fire? Act swiftly and be clear in your intentions, and ideally be sort of practice. Don't be frightened of a crisis. Be like, oh, let's keep an eye on it. Let's have a quick incident management team meeting and just discuss it, and then we'll chat again in a few days. What's the harm? It also shows teams and your workforce that you're taking it seriously. Have a crisis communication plan. Understand your core functions, otherwise you are going to struggle. Something will drop, and the time frames. And strong crisis leadership does pay dividends. We saw it during COVID. Weak crisis management can end an organization. So that is a whistle-stop tour through business resilience. We are obviously available to help if anyone has any would like any support, or happy to answer questions at the end. And I will hand you back to Guy. Or no, I'll hand you to Simon.
Thanks, Nick. That was brilliant. Most importantly, though, I want to know, did the pizza oven arrive?
No, it's still not here.
Oh, no.
I know, they're really having trouble.
What is the world coming to?
It's harrowing.
Morning, everybody. I'm here to talk about what you do when you don't listen to Nick, in short. So you don't plan, you don't take your learnings that we've all had from COVID, and you get hit by another surprise. And it was interesting, Nick talking about ICT. I was talking to someone on this call actually only last week about, can you imagine how we would have survived all these lockdowns 10 years ago before we had Zoom and Teams and the remote technologies that we've got now? Losing that would have made it a very different pandemic, I think, for lots of us. But anyway, we're imagining a world which I know won't occur, because you're all going to do the planning after listening to Nick. But you've got this friend, right, who hasn't done the planning, didn't listen to Nick, and has found themselves in a bit of a pickle. And as a consequence of that is suffering some financial difficulty, and there is a need to restructure the business. And I don't mean you restructure as a euphemism for insolvency here. I mean restructure as in rebuild, repurpose the business and send it on to a profitable future. So firstly, I thought it was probably worth just touching on what a chief restructuring officer, or CRO, is. They've been known as many things over the years: company doctors, turnaround consultants, all broadly the same thing. The sole reason that we now call them CROs is because everybody else had a C in their acronym, and we felt left out. When even the IT guy is known as the CTO, you know that you need to be part of that C-suite to be taken seriously. So Chief Restructuring Officer is what we're calling ourselves this week. But more broadly, it's somebody within an organization, either from outside, so when I take on these sort of roles, I'm coming in from the outside, or internally, that is given the space, both mentally and physically, and power to make changes, and to make them probably quicker than the organization is used to, because inevitably when we're in a state of crisis, there is a need to act well, but act promptly. And so what I'm going to try and do briefly this morning is talk through the sort of 5 stages that I would go through, that hopefully gives you some of the tools, if God forbid you find yourself in this circumstance, to be able to take some steps. Now, I talk about them as being 5 stages. It's not a Gantt chart, 5 stages. They very much sort of all merge into one, and certainly at various stages it feels like you're trying to do too many of them all at once. But they do break down into sort of 5 distinct areas, so I'll try and deal with them as best I can in that sort of order. So first and foremost, steady the ship. Okay, we're in a state of turmoil. We need to settle everybody back down again. We need to settle our staff. We probably need to settle ourselves to a certain extent, but settle down the staff. Talk to us, the key stakeholders, customers, suppliers, lenders, whomever it may be that we rely on heavily to keep this business on the road, and just explain to them that we know there's a problem. Okay, probably at this stage, we don't have the solution, and that can make us feel a bit vulnerable because we're going to people on who we rely and saying, there's a problem here, and I don't actually have the solution. I might have an inkling of it in the back of my mind. I might have a feel for where we're going, but because I haven't planned, I don't actually have the solution, and therefore I need you to give me some time. And that is showing some vulnerability, and it goes against something which I quite often tell clients, which is don't admit the problem until you've got the solution, but often you just don't have the time. But by admitting it, by being honest, you will gain yourself a modicum of credibility, because the people outside the organisation will have seen the turmoil, they will have seen the Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal, or they would have seen whatever it is, and they will be worried that you haven't seen that it's a really big problem, and therefore that you're not taking steps. So by being upfront and being honest about it, you will gain some credibility. It won't be enough to see you through yet. There's more that we have to do, but nothing will terrify them more than thinking that you're just thinking it's a normal day in the office while the fire's, looking at the windows. Planning. So as I said, it's always nice to have a solution to go along with your problem, but if you haven't got one in place yet, then planning is the next thing that we need to think about. Build a strategy of exactly what this route out of our particular predicament is going to look like. How are we going to get out there? What are we going to do? What's it going to look like? What resources are we going to need that perhaps we don't already have? Is that financial resources? Is it other things that we'll need? Is it support from other stakeholders? Is there going to be a cash flow trough at some point? Maybe we need to invest in a new bit of kit or something to bring about our new product that's going to be our saving grace. Plot out what those are, because we're going to need to go and talk to our stakeholders, and we're going to need to get them on board with this plan. So we need to know what we're going to be asking them for. Build in flex. Okay, so don't promise the earth and then think, oh yeah, no, well, with a good fair wind, we'll be able to deliver this. Okay, work out what the best case scenario is, and then build yourself a big chunk of buffer on the other end, because there is nothing better than over delivery. Okay, if we tell everybody that we're going to have done it by the 30th of June and we do it by mid-May, that's awesome. If we tell them we're going to do it by mid-May and we do it by the end of June, probably we won't make the end of June. So build in that buffer. Don't be afraid to give yourself some space to have hiccups along the way, because trust me, I've never dealt with one where there haven't been hiccups along the way. So you will need that space. Also think about alternatives. So I do a lot of mountaineering and hill climbing, and you always build into your route map alternative routes back down the mountain. If the cloud cover comes down or the weather turns out for the worst, alternative routes to get back to your car usually, but in this case back to your state of recovery. So build in some alternatives. You might not come clean about all those alternatives to your stakeholders at that time. You might keep them in your back pocket, but certainly you need them, even if you're not being transparent about all of them at the outset. Do you feel able to involve the stakeholders in the planning phase? It will very much depend on the relationship that you've got with them, but especially if they're critical to the eventual outcome, then you kind of want them involved. And involving them, you may build a sort of embryonic plan and then get them engaged and get them involved in the detail of that planning. But that will build you huge credibility and guarantees you the buy-in from them. If they've been involved in that planning process and agreed with it and signed off on it with you, they're invested. And there's nothing better than having those stakeholders invested in the delivery of that plan along with you. The next stage sort of comes into this, but build into your plan some quick wins. Okay, we don't have a lot of credibility. We're borrowing goodwill right, left, and centre. Those quick wins will really cement in the fact that your plan can work, that it is working, that we're delivering what we said we'd do. These plans will often take months and years. So nobody has that much patience in business. Okay, none of us. We all need to see something tangible early on. So whether it's selling off a non-core asset, mothballing an underperforming part of the business, whatever it might be, build in something that you can deliver relatively quickly. and then set yourself up to make a song and a dance about it when you do, because you're going to need that to build in that credibility, and it really does help to cement that trust from stakeholders. Once you've got your plan together, and assuming that you haven't sort of built stakeholders into that planning process, then you've got to negotiate that plan and get the buy-in from everybody that it can work. As I say, if you can involve them in that planning process, then this stage becomes a lot easier, because otherwise it can be quite hard, usually because you've got competing interests. We might need the buy-in of the bank to deliver us the working capital that we need to do it. We might need a key supplier to stay on board with us, because without their bit of kit or whatever it is, we can't possibly deliver. And it might be that key customer that, quite frankly, without their business, it's all looking a bit dicey. All three of those individuals, and often there's more, will all have competing interests. Yes, they will all tell you that what they want most in their life is to see this business survive, but what they mean is, what I want most in this life is to see my business survive, and if your business survives, then that's all well and good too. So you've got to manage those competing interests and get everybody around the table to agree that this plan is the plan that we all believe can work. As a consequence, there's going to be a lot of to and fro, and do think, oh, we can play Zoom bingo. That was the doorbell going. So do think outside the box in terms of what you can do to bring those parties to the table and get them to buy in. And it doesn't need to necessarily be about money. I mean, often it sort of boils down to that, but do try and think about alternative ways of building trust. So we dealt with one a couple of years ago, manufacturing business, trying to get everybody to sign off on this deal to move things forward. And we had a very key customer, and we had one supplier on whom we were entirely reliant to be able to deliver the product for this customer. Both sides were nervous. The customer was concerned that we were going to deliver the product that they wanted, and that was going to have knock-on financial impacts onto their business and onto their end customer. Our supplier was incredibly nervous that they were going to deliver the products and then not get paid, and we weren't in a position to be able to pay them up front, as is often the case. So we got them both together in a room. We spoke to them both. We said, look, customer, you're worried that you're going to be left in the lurch. You buy the kit from our supplier direct. You retain ownership for that bit of kit. It gets delivered to our site. We will add our bit of know-how and our bit of intelligence and manufacturing to that bit of kit. You retain ownership throughout that process. When we deliver, you'll have already paid the supplier for their bit of kit. So supplier's happy, customer's happy, because they know they've at least got something to come out the other end, no matter what happens in the interim. And both sides then feel more comfortable. There is more trust, there's more transparency, and we were then able to move forward and deliver the eventual product. But it didn't cost us anything. We still got the profit out of selling on the end product. If anything, it saved us some cash flow headache that we were going to struggle to manage otherwise. So do think about what else might win that trust and might get you over the finish line. The finish line is then the final stage. We've got to deliver on all of this. Okay, so we've built the plan. We've got everybody to buy into it. And then we've actually got to come good on all that stuff that we said we were going to do. These are generally long-term plans, as I said before. Keep the momentum up, get those quick wins in, make a song and dance about them, to the point where everybody's sick of hearing about them. You know, that if that's the worst that happens, then it's not the end of the world. So do hammer those home. Do keep communicating. Nick commented on this. You can't over communicate. Okay. Build in weekly, fortnightly calls with the stakeholders, whatever it is, until the stakeholder says, I don't think we need to have next week's call, or I don't, because that's a great thing to be able to hear, because that means that you've reached that point where the trust has built up and they don't need that constant comfort. So build those in, and even if you don't think you've got anything to say, make sure you have those calls just so that they know you're still there, you're still on it. And as I say, wait until that point where they say, actually, we're good now. I think we're fine. You've delivered on this, that, and the other. And we're happy that we're moving on. And we'll call you next time we want an update. But that's where you want to get to. But do keep it going. I mean, often this is, on longer term plans, my role then becomes about nagging. And it is just a case of my role is then to nag the rest of the C-suite, the rest of the management team into making sure that they're keeping those things up to date. And not letting that timescale drift, making sure we're still delivering on time and on plan. And then you can relax, because then it's just business as usual, which, as we all know, is just a breeze, isn't it? So, and then I tell you what, then what you do is then you phone Nick and you get a plan in so that it doesn't happen again. And I was thinking while Nick was talking, because we had the benefit of a chat last week, that the idea of planning for the outcome, not necessarily the disaster itself, is crucial. Whether they're little green men from Venus or little red men from Mars, when they land in the UK and invade, they will become residents and they will need tax returns. And that's what I've taken away from today. So hopefully that's helpful. As Nick said, either of us are more than happy to take questions. So I don't know whether there's been anything in the Q&A today, but Guy, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I'll be making notes myself in terms of what we potentially need to bring in ourselves to kind of make sure we can get the right outcome. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Guy, it's like cobbler's shoes. We worry about other people's disaster plans, not our own.
Yeah, entirely. There's no Q&As at the moment. So if people who are on the call want to drop in questions, you're more than welcome to. I mean, I had one, if that's okay, if I maybe start this, Nick. You mentioned Lloyd's midway through your conversation about the fact that they kind of went through this scenario planning and did a test run, which kind of is, you'd expect Lloyd's of London in the risk sort of world to kind of be risk averse and probably thinking that far ahead. In terms of organizations that don't necessarily kind of work in that sphere and with that mindset, how do you push down the sort of resilience planning and culture within an organization? Is there a few kind of key things that you can kind of look to bring in?
So so I think underpinning, embedding the planning or the response is crucial, and you need to think of it at every level. Think of it. I think that's my doorbell. That's just gone actually. You need to think about it at all levels. So firstly, you want, if the organization doesn't want to do it, then there's no point in doing it really, or you're going to have a limited effect. So as usual, you need to get strategic buy-in. I would always, if you're got responsibility for it and you're trying to get people to get on board, do an exercise, do a 2-hour half-day exercise, get someone like us in, and we'll say, right, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, there's been a fire at the, and try and get all your key people. So you want the chief exec to be making eyes with the head of IT, who's making eyes with the head of customer services, realizing the impacts of something like this. And then you'll find that they go back and brief their teams. And then if you come along with your project plan at that point and say, right, it's now time to do the business impact analysis, help them through it. So, do what you can, sort of, this is what good looks like, and this is the criteria, have support sessions and so on. And then as you go through the process, people you see the penny starting to drop, and you start to get that buy-in at the local level. But you have to, someone can just walk into your reception, film themselves, and cause a crisis management crisis if it's handled poorly, by someone at reception, for example. So do the people at reception understand that they've got a role to play in crisis management and so on? So look at it at all levels, have a program in place, get strategic buy-off, and if you're not sure where to start, do a good exercise. It really is such a no-brainer, and you'll quickly find, even things like out of hours fire. Okay, well, how do you find out? Well, the fire service tell us. No, the fire service don't tell you. So do your out of hours service tell you? Do they work out of hours? Do you have their contact details? Do they ring the caretaker? Where does the caretaker live? It's that basic stuff, and that will get the conversation going. So all levels, strategic sign off and a buy-in and exercise would be my recommendations.
And in terms of, you started your talk with the sort of business continuity accreditation through ISO.
Yeah.
What benefits of that, and I guess, is it worth it? Because presumably that kind of aligns with what you're talking about, just on a more formal basis.
Yeah, definitely. So they're both very good. Like anything, they're useful. You can align to them, so they're definitely worth aligning to. But what, and I would definitely worth, we can help get you sort of get through that process if you want accreditation. But one thing you need to sort of bear in mind is, the jig is up on business resilience now. We've had so many incidents that is particularly in the public sector, but increasingly in the private sector, people are saying, yeah, sure, if you want to contract with us, that's great, but you need to have a ISO compliant business continuity plan, or, and we want to review it. So, and particularly if you're going to start contracting with the public sector, they're going to expect that more and more and more, and they're going to test it more and more and more because they're paying people like us to do that, to eyeball those plans and say, actually, no, this doesn't make sense. It's definitely something that you should consider, even if you just align to it. It really depends. I'm quite pragmatic, so I think it really depends on your sort of business. And if you do the process and you go, actually, it's quite simple, we're all virtual, we're fairly resilient, then great. But if you sort of medium size or anything, you can be at risk. So align to it, but definitely consider that you might be required. Or if you are yourselves contracting with key suppliers, make sure they've got one, and then make sure someone independent has reviewed it and said, yeah, it's a health and safety plan with business continuity written on it. Or require them to do an exercise joint. We've done that before. So big contract, let's do a joint exercise. Let's do your plans and our plans and go through it, and we'll tell you whether it's going to work or not. That's a really useful thing.
I get the impression that supply chain is becoming more and more important. I think Daimler announced last week or the week before last that they were going to look to manufacture their own chips because they found that they can't produce any cars now because nobody can get hold of silicon. So, which is odd because I thought that was just sand. And there seems to be loads of that. So I can't quite work out what the problem is. Maybe I don't understand the technology.
And absolutely, and you can pick those things up through the business impact analysis. So you can say, for this function, we need these materials or these systems, and where can we source these from? It helps you really understand systematically what you're dealing with. Which, if you're a small or a medium organization, you might not have that. If you're a large production company, you might, and it might be more strategic challenges. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Oh, I've got 2 questions come in. Working from home was the old contingency for a workplace problem. Now that it is the new norm, what is the new contingency and what should we be looking at? Yeah,
so co-location. So no one really expected social distancing. The government, we hadn't, in the civil world, we didn't plan for national lockdown. We just didn't. So any company that has gone, any organization that's managed to implement that social distancing and so on has done a fantastic job, should be really proud of themselves, and probably have cracked it now, cracked remote working. But absolutely, you can if we lost cyber now, this is sort of over, this event. And if you have a crisis on top, you will need to co-locate. So you need a plan for no cyber. Do it as an exercise like anything else. Do it as part of your business impact analysis. Consider your dependency on cyber, on your ICT, and have a mitigation plan for if you don't have it. It is loss of cyber is the big fear now. Denial of access to site is of less concern because of COVID, particularly offices, but production and stuff is slightly different. But also it's also about mitigating. It's about mitigating the risk. So can you mitigate it earlier before it gets to a problem, because you realize it would be devastating and actually it's worth putting in, I don't know, barriers out the front or something like that. Yeah. And
then I guess speaking in terms of barriers out the front, we've got another question then. So how do you know when you've moved from crisis management into just needing plain old insolvency advice? I assume this is...
It depends whether I turn up in my hearse or in my car, I think is the answer. The reality is, especially from inside the organisation, it's really hard to tell because often you're so busy putting out fires that you don't have time to take a step back. I think the reality is that you seek advice early. I have lots of conversations with businesses where they say, we're a bit worried, this has happened, we've suffered this big bad debt or whatever it might be, and the cash is a bit tight. And often those conversations don't go very far in that I say, okay, well, you're right, that is a problem, but you can take these steps to put this in place to stop it becoming an insolvency issue. And they go away and they never darken my doorway again. And that's generally considered a good day in the office. But I think it is really difficult to tell from the inside whether something is recoverable or not. There aren't really any markers. It's all about, well, can we build a plan to take us back out of the mess that we're currently in? And you can do that internally, but often, and I would say this, wouldn't I? Often it's helpful to have somebody outside, especially if it's me, who can just see the wood for the trees and just is less embedded in the day-to-day.
One thing I would add to that is in sort of the civil response, and we've seen it, since Buncefield, actually, since the oil depot explosion in Buncefield, there was sort of obviously that was a huge, biggest explosion of fire in peacetime Europe. destroyed an industrial estate, an industrial site, huge importance, particularly important one. Start the recovery process almost not straight away, but we start talking, and us as tactical advisors start saying we need to start thinking about recovery after 24, 72 hours. So if you can afford, if you can resource wise, appoint a strategic lead as recovery and get them to start thinking about recovery while you deal with the crisis, and then sort of make sure that you're joined up. But you definitely want to start considering the longer term impacts, longer term recovery early on, and that's definitely what happens in the civil world now, and it is useful. But again, it's a massive resource implication. But again, if you know what your core functions are, you know what it takes to resource them, you know what resources you've got to deal with, and you can start redeploying staff to support, and you know what you're dealing with then.
Or using up the goodwill, as Simon referred to earlier. I think we've got time for one more question. We've got plan for the unexpected and the expected, with the expected being emphasised. What are the top 5 in the latter as SMEs transition back to normal?
Cyber, adverse weather, I'd probably just plan for that. I mean, Google the National Risk Register. It would depend on your industry. It would depend on your sector, but Google the National Risk Register. It's only the detailed terrorist stuff is classified, but the rest of it is pretty much open. But yeah, I think cyber and adverse weather, particularly flooding, they're coming. We know they're coming. It's just a matter of when. Yeah, I think I would definitely focus on that in terms of strategic threats, and then I would look at something simple like denial of access. So just follow through a fire drill if you're all evacuated and it's pouring with rain in the winter. That's where I'd put my energies if you're not sure where to start. But again, it's worth having a sort of a facilitated exercise just to help you risk assess and plan through some of this stuff.
And I know from our point of view, for Mr. Langdon, thinking about what Nick was talking about today, our disaster recovery plan used to say, well, if there's a problem at one of our offices, it's fine, we'll all relocate to one of the other offices, which of course, March last year didn't work. We had to do something else entirely. We were quite lucky that what we did work. But I won't lie and say there was a plan for it, because there definitely wasn't.
I think we need to be careful, because often we speak to people, I mean, I totally agree, but often we speak to people and say, it's fine, we dealt with a fire 20 years ago and it was like a Swiss watch. It's like, well, that's great, but time's moved on and you don't have a plan for a flood. So it's definitely, it really is sort of minimum relatively investment to think about things like your risk and stuff like that early on to potentially mitigate catastrophe. So yeah, no, definitely worth considering before you call Simon.
Well, thank you ever so much. Thank you for all the questions that have come through, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks all. Goodbye.
Cheers.